Hello and welcome to Religious Studies 100. The topic for today's class is Feminist Liberation Theology and Black Liberation Theology. These two liberation theologies share the same common denominators that we studied for Latin American liberation theology. So pretty much we will see an illustration of how those denominators, which we will review now at the beginning of the class, apply to other questions besides the problems, the economic problems of Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s. So let's first review what those common denominators were for all liberation theologies, and which we emphasized in the case of the first liberation theology we studied, Latin American liberation theology. We said that liberation theologies have a Marxist and a postmodern inspiration to them. This was very typical of the late 60s and early 70s. It goes with the times. These things really go with the times sometimes. On the part of Marxism, they take the idea of class struggle, class conflict, systemic conflict. Now, liberation theologies and liberation theologians are not materialistic thinkers. These are not materialistic ideologies. They're not purely Marxist. They take certain ideas from Marxism that they find useful. If they were purely Marxist, if their ideas were purely materialistic, we wouldn't be doing theology. They wouldn't be doing theology. There would be no reference to God or religion, okay? So they take these ideas that they find useful. The idea of a class struggle. There are always two groups in society, the oppressors and the oppressed. In the case of Latin American liberation theology, the focus is on the rich, the wealthy, and the poor. A second idea which comes from Marxism is that these two groups are locked in their predicament. They're locked in their sin, in their systemic sin. They're trapped in there, and they can't get out easily. The oppressed, obviously, because they're being oppressed by force, by the oppressor, so they can't get out of their oppression. But also the oppressors are unable to get out of this systemic sin. This system, which is the sin, which is a group sin. It comes with the system, and they have to be liberated, sometimes, in the case of Latin American liberation theology, through the use of force and revolution. Remember that? On the side of postmodern philosophy, what we see is that the way in which those with power implement their view of things on others, on the powerless, is a process which takes several steps. First, there is a selection of that kind of knowledge, or those pieces of knowledge that you find more convenient in order to protect your personal status. Then a legitimization. Remember, you put that in printed word or somewhere, or publish books and make it look important, official. And then finally, dissemination. You teach that in schools. You have the books out for sale in libraries. Now, we said there is no moral indictment concerning that process. Things have to be done that way. We talked about the history book. We can't have a history book that contains all events from the past. That's impossible. So there's nothing immoral or unethical about the selection process and the legitimization process and dissemination. It has to be done that way. What the postmodern thinker wants to know is, why are you selecting what you're selecting? Who's paying you to make that selection and not others? Remember the letters being sent to the New York Times, letters to the editor section? And we said, well, they can't publish all of the letters people send, so someone must select. But we want to know why that person selected his letter and not her letter. And then we found out that it turns out that his daddy is best friends with, for example, okay? So the postmodern thinker wants to know why you're making that selection and not a different selection. Why you're investigating this particular molecule and not something else. Who's paying you for this? With what purpose? That's what the postmodern thinker wants to know. So these two lines of thought, these two types of criticism come together in the late 60s and early 70s, and they influence these theological movements, religion of all things, okay? So we remember in the case of Latin American liberation theology, how we said that there is a suspicion that traditional theology is what Marxists would call a class theology, meaning an ideology that's meant to protect the interests of the powerful, and which disguises itself in the form of logical and good for everyone and impartial, but which in reality focuses on only certain aspects of the Gospels while ignoring others. Because the ones making the selection of what counts as important turns out to be a person who's working, so to say, for the powerful and the wealthy. Okay? So these are the bases for both kinds of liberation theology that we're going to study today. Feminist liberation theology and black liberation theology. So let's get now on with feminist liberation theology first. The author that I want you to remember is Mary Daly. Her name is Mary Daly. She's quite a colorful theologian and the author of a book called The Church and the Second Sex. The Church and the Second Sex. That title mimics the very famous and pioneering philosophy work on the part of a French feminist, Simone de Beauvoir, whose title was The Second Sex. So Mary Daly's book now is called The Church and the Second Sex. 1970 book, okay? Around 1970, not sure, 1969, 71, around 1970. In her book, she argues for the equality of women in the Catholic Church. She was a Catholic theologian. Now, you know, in the Catholic Church, women cannot be ordained priests, and thus they can never get to the position of bishops, much less pope or anything. So she's arguing for equality in the Catholic Church. Later on, she became disillusioned, and she decided it was pointless to call for equality in the Catholic Church for women. And she became so disillusioned and so disappointed that she left the church altogether, and she left Christianity altogether, and she became a witch. Why a witch? Well, some feminists think that, not that they really believe that witches make pacts with the devil or stuff like that, but they believe that witches in the Middle Ages were persecuted and burned at the stake because they were powerful women. And so men were afraid of them, of their powers, their supposed powers. Okay? So these women who become witches today do not really believe that they have any special powers or anything, but they perform the rituals of witchcraft from the past because they believe that those were rituals of empowerment for women. So that's the whole thing behind it. Okay? Same with Wiccans, same kind of thing. Okay? Not that they really think there is any supernatural power behind, but they think that those rituals were cultural symbols of power, of feminine power. But then something happened. Her book was so successful that a couple of years later, the publisher wanted to have a second edition out. And so she was asked to authorize a second edition of her book. And this really put him in a big dilemma, because how could she possibly authorize a second edition, a new edition of a book in which she was arguing as a Catholic theologian for the equality of women in the church, when she no longer believed in the church, much less she would argue for equality for women in the church. Right? She wasn't even a Christian at all. So eventually, she agreed to this new edition on condition that the new edition would be published with a post-Christian introduction, which is kind of funny. Okay? In her post-Christian introduction, she talks about herself as some strange woman, that she must have been really naive when she was writing that book. So she distances herself from the author of the book, which is, of course, herself. And she can't understand how could a woman say those things anymore, like asking for equality within the church. What was that woman thinking about? She talks about herself as being really this other person. And then she goes on to say, well, ask for a woman to ask for equality within the church, she says, it's like for a black person to ask for equality within the Ku Klux Klan. She says that. Which is interesting because while she was writing that, she was still teaching, and she kept on teaching for many years at Boston College, which is a Catholic college of all places. I can't imagine a black person teaching at a Ku Klux Klan college, would you? So here you see the difference between what people say and then the reality of life and where your salary comes from, okay? To put it in a crude manner. You have the excerpts from Mary Daly's book on your Moodle page. So if you go in there, you can read from in her own words the things she says, okay? How she deals with herself from the distance of 2 years, now that she's no longer a Catholic theologian or a Christian theologian at all. Now, what's special about feminist liberation theology? Well, you can guess that the two classes in a state of conflict, in this case, are not the rich and the poor, the wealthy and the oppressed, but what? Men and women, thank you. Men and women. Now, in Latin American liberation theology, you could liberate the wealthy from their sin by taking away their money, right? You liberate them from their sin by taking away their money. What can you do for men to liberate them from their sin of being males? Well, I tell you, very little. Very little. I mean, I guess you just subject them to hormonal treatment or something and turn them into women. But other than that, very little. So in a sense, feminist liberation theology, the brand exemplified by Mary Daly, is more radical than Latin American liberation theology or than the other theologies for that matter, okay? There is nothing you can do to liberate men from their sin of being men. In radical feminist theory, men are seen as essentially different from women. Now, pay attention to this word, essentially versus accidentally. Two very different things. All feminists, most feminists, think that what we call masculinity and femininity are social and cultural constructions, inventions. What do we associate with masculinity? Say with femininity first. What do we associate with femininity? Look at the women in this class and tell me, what is it that's different in the superficial manner, what the way they look from the men in the class? There is something I see in all of the women in the class, which I don't see in any of the men. Beauty? What is it that's different? It's conventional. All of them have long hair. Now, men can have long hair today if they choose to, but look at the men in the class. None of the men in the class have long hair. Well, all of the women in the class have clearly long hair. That's part of the construction of femininity, okay? Tell me more things, more stuff. Things that we associate with femininity. Huh? What? What's that? Lipstick. Any man with lipstick in the class? No? Not that we see. Lipstick. What about colors? What colors do we associate with women? Pink. She has a kind of pink shirt. What colors do we associate with men? Blue. Have the guy in the blue shirt. You have another woman with a pink shirt, two of them, and several men with blue. Okay, that's the construction of femininity and the construction of masculinity. Now, most feminists agree that if we erased those constructions, we would end up with two essentially equal beings, no difference. However, the radical feminists say no, not so. If we do away with those appearances, those constructs of masculinity and femininity, we'll end up with two essentially different beings. Men who are terrorists by nature, who want to subjugate women under oppression, and women who are the victims. And men have imposed their ways on women, their way of seeing things on women, their way of doing things on women, their way of reasoning on women. Because men and women are different, they have different ways of dealing with social relations and with the environment in general. Men are more mathematical, more dissecting, while women are more holistic, more, they take feeling more into consideration. But because men have the upper hand, we all have to be like men if we want to succeed. So women who have to succeed is because they have become like men. And so, of course, men are always on top because they are better at playing their game. They know the rules better. That's the position of the radical feminists. Okay? How do you liberate men from that? Well, very, very, very difficult. Right? Very difficult. Because for the radical feminists, all men are part of this conspiracy against women. And that includes homosexual men, too. They make no distinctions. So, as far as the common denominator, there you are. There's a social struggle between men and women. Men live in their systemic sin, in their state of sin, out of which they can hardly be liberated. How do they impose their view of women? Well, the men are the builders of culture. We make the decisions. We determine what comes across as beautiful, even in art. We make the laws, and we allow only certain women to do those jobs when they have become like men, when they function like us. So the radical feminists really offer no solution except just a permanent state of war between men and women, and desire, struggle on the part of women to liberate themselves from men. So that's really as much as we can say about radical feminist theology. Now, in most of these theologies, what you find is not so much solutions, because I know what's on your mind right now is, okay, then what? Then what? Well, there is no answer for that. But criticisms. And that's okay. Okay, so this is what the situation is like. This is what we are denouncing. Okay, but what do you suggest we do? Well, we don't find an answer to that, usually. We're still in the phase of the criticism. Okay, now we move on to Black liberation theology. For Black liberation theology, the name that I want you to remember is James Cone, who at about the same time as Mary Daly was writing her book, is also writing his best known book. But please understand, Mary Daly has written many more books besides this one. Okay? And James Cone has also written quite a number of books. I'm just going to mention one of them. A Theology of Black Liberation. This is the one that I want you to remember. Okay? A Theology of Black Liberation. Or to be precise, A Black Theology of Liberation. That's the actual title. A Black Theology of Liberation. The dates of the book, again, early 70s, 1971 or so. Again, you need to place yourself back in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. All of the liberationist movements, a society very divided, along racial lines, the civil rights movement, a lot of confrontation. And so that's where he's getting the energy and the ideas then to write in this book. Let me read some excerpts. You also have this on your Moodle page, but let me read some excerpts for you, okay? He says, Black theology will not spend much time trying to answer the critics because it is accountable only to the black community. In Nazi Germany, the Jews found out the hard way that there was no security in economic power against an insane people who had the political and social power to determine Jewish existence. Realizing that white racism is an insanity comparable to Nazism, black theology seeks to articulate a theological ethos that is consistent with the black revolutionary struggle. Black people know that there is only one possible authentic existence in this society, and that is to force a radical revolutionary confrontation with the structures of white power by saying yes to the essence of their black being. Again, revolutionary confrontation, think of Latin American liberation theology. They're saying the same at the same time in a different context. And the radical feminists also talk about revolutionary confrontation, although not in an openly violent manner, because they just didn't see it that way. To be black is to be committed to destroying everything this country loves and adores. There can be no black theology which does not take seriously the black experience, a life of humiliation and suffering. This must be the point of departure of all God talk, which seeks to be black talk. This means that black theology realizes that it is man who speaks of God, and when that man is black, he can only speak of God in the light of black experience. Black people want to know what Christ means when they are confronted with the brutality of white racism. What does the church mean when white churchmen proclaim they need more time to end racism? The black experience is the feeling one has when he strikes against the enemy of black humanity by throwing a live Molotov cocktail into a white-owned building and watching it go up in flames. Black history in America means that white people used every conceivable method to destroy black humanity. As late as 1857, the highest court of this land decreed that black people had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. Black theology came into being when black churchmen realized that killing slave masters was doing the work of God. It began when black churchmen refused to accept the racist white church as consistent with the gospel of God. The goal of black theology is the destruction of everything white, in italics, so that black people can be liberated from alien gods. Black theology must show that the God of black people has nothing to do with the God worshipped in white churches whose, whose primary purpose is to sanctify the racism of whites and to dub the wounds of blacks. Black theology will accept only the love of God which participates in the destruction of the white enemy. Okay, pretty radical language, as you can tell. Now, later on, James Cone, of course, he was bombarded with criticisms from many theologians, many black theologians who said, you're going past the limits of what we can do as theologians. You're no longer a theologian. You're totally identifying with the black liberation movement at the expense of theology. And so, we are first of all Christians, and as Christians, we're all united, and we can't really take what you're saying. So he was the object of a lot of criticisms. But then he clarified that he's using the words black and white as coded words. So that's why I emphasize, he says white in italics. The word white stands for oppressor. And he specifies it has nothing to do with skin color. He actually says that later in his book. While the word black stands for oppressed, the victim of an irrational, arbitrary oppression. So that, he clarifies, there are white people who are black, and there are black people who are white. It so happens that most white people are white in italics, most white people are oppressors, and most black people are black, oppressed. But he's using the words not necessarily linked to skin color, but to situation in society. Oppressor and oppressed, victim of arbitrary discrimination. Nothing, I wouldn't say nothing to do with race. It has to do with race in the sense that that oppression concentrates mostly on people of a particular race. That's why he uses the word black as a coded word for oppressed. But it's really separate from race. He says there are white people who are black, oppressed, unjustly discriminated, arbitrarily discriminated, and there are black people who are oppressors too. Maybe very few of those, and many of the others, but still, it doesn't really go necessarily. He makes that clarification, which puts his work in a whole different perspective, okay? So when he talks about blacks and whites, all this radical language, you have to think of oppressors and oppressed in the context of the US. Now, this is an American theology. Latin American liberation theology happens in Latin America in a Catholic context. Feminist liberation theology with Mary Daly happens in the Western, in the rich world, in the US, but still within a Catholic context. Now, James Cone does not come from a Catholic context, but from a Protestant context. Right? And he's talking really to a very specific situation in the late 60s and early 70s in the US. You have to put these theologies in context. So in a sense, black liberation theology is radical as it sounds, in the words of James Cone, less radical than feminist liberation theology. Because here, clearly, you can liberate both the oppressors and the oppressed from their systemic sin. If you are oppressing others arbitrarily and justly, there is something we can do to that. We can remove you from your position. We can denounce you. We can do some kind of revolutionary struggle against the structures that oppress people. And we can thus liberate you from your systemic sin. While, as I said, in the case of men and women, it's harder really to think of ways of liberating men from their systemic sin as oppressors. Thank you.